What does it take to make workshops work? And how can we facilitate collaboration that sticks and leads to results? My name is Miriam Hatness, and with the Workshops Work podcast, I'm on the mission to find the magic ingredients that make workshops work. Today with me on the show is a returning guest. It's Romy Alexandra, who today demystifies experiential learning for us. So stay tuned. And by the way, if you want to support the show to remain free and accessible for all, please consider a small donation via workshops.work/support. And now, lean back and enjoy the show. Romy, welcome back.
Thank you, Miriam. So happy to be back.
Yes, I'm looking forward. Last time we spoke about psychological safety.
Mm-hmm.
And today we're speaking about experiential learning.
Yeah.
Yes. And we just warmed up our vocal cords with a little chit chat before we hit the record button. And you shared this beautiful sentence, I live by the rules of open space.
Yes.
Why don't we start with that?
Okay. Yeah, let's kick it off.
As a warm-up question, because those who want to know when and why you started calling yourself a facilitator, listen to our first episode.
Yeah. So if anyone doesn't know what open space technology is, it's an absolute great methodology. Highly recommend you to check it out. Should I give a little background on it? Sure, I'll give a little background on it just to give some context. If you don't know, it's essentially like the unconference. So a lot of facilitators, we love to use this approach. The creator, Harrison Owen, he basically said that he felt like more richness and more impact often happens at conferences in the coffee breaks instead of in the actual conference. And so he's like, how could we transform the way we're gathering so that it always feels like a coffee break? Hence, he created open space. And so I love this. It's actually a tool I love to use. It's one of my favorite formats. And like I just said, I literally live by these rules of open space because I think any facilitator, it's a great way to approach life. And the four really key principles are whoever comes are the right people, right? So we're always, especially in this online space, thinking like, okay, maybe, I don't know, 100 people sign up, but then we only get 50 people there, or vice versa. Now we have these interesting calendar invites and people just show up without registering. And so how, as you know, for me as a facilitator, I'm always trying to really be flexible and adaptable to whoever is there is the right people. Even if it's one person, who knows? Then that was the only, that's the only thing that could have happened. So whoever comes are the right people. Whatever happens is the only thing that could have happened, right? So we often can go in with these expectations as facilitators of, okay, these are my desired outcomes. This is how I plan the session. It's going to go this way. And I've really learned that we can love our design, but we need to love our participants more and let their experience speak for itself and be open to, hey, this could take a totally different detour. And that's okay. Like, how do we create space for that? The other ones are whenever it starts is the right time. Okay. I will say that I have to give a little disclaimer, right? I don't want to ever show up late to anything as a facilitator. But, we often may, again, come in with these preconceived notions of this is when we're going to get to the meat of, why we're here. And this is where things are really going to kick off or people are going to start engaging. And, whenever it starts, maybe it happens in a different part. Maybe something else unfolds. Maybe the timing you originally not imagined, totally, who knows, transforms. And so, yeah, just being open to that possibility as well as whenever it ends. What is it? It's whenever it ends is the right time.
Time for it to end. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I often, even with an online, we're always thinking about online, but even in person, like those extra moments at the end, right? When people come up to you and then it really, cultivates new conversations and people connecting and all of a sudden you're there and a little 1-minute question at the end becomes like, who knows, a 30-minute nice and rich and nourishing discussion. So I really believe in all those. And the last ones, which are the law, there's only one law, which is the law of 2 feet, or in the online space, the law of 2 clicks, which basically says you can be a bumblebee and you can really love to get down to the work, really focus on one thing and stay laser focused. And some people like to be more butterfly. So in the open space context, this is nice. You can kind of float from session to session or be a bumblebee and stay in one particular session. But for me, what the real meaning behind that process is, the law of 2 feet is really about, if you feel that you are not directly contributing or not directly getting out of a session what you imagined, you have every right, well, in open space context, you have every right to leave and go someplace else where you feel that you could contribute more. I guess that becomes much more possible now in the online space. I see, people can leave. But I also take it, for me, a deeper meaning of like, take ownership over your own learning, right? And I think that's what's so important as facilitators or trainers, or I believe anyone really in the learning space. We are not there to impose. We are there to cultivate from within and empower each learner in that space to take ownership over their own learning process. And if they're not getting something, how can I, as a facilitator, create a space where they feel they can contribute in a new way? They can maybe bring their new ideas. They could shift the program or decide to actually facilitate something themselves, or who knows, create something totally different. And I think all of those principles are life, guideposts for us as facilitators, both in and for me, I think for sure in my personal, but also in my professional for sure. And also even my personal life, life is full of uncertainties. If anything, the past 3 years has taught us is that, and how we approach it can make all the difference.
Yeah. Wonderful. And this, adjusting to uncertainty, embracing uncertainty is one of the facilitation superpowers. And I think in what you described, there's this open space mentality also embraces some of the basic principles of facilitation, is that we acknowledge that the wisdom is in the room. And it's not only the speakers who are invited to a conference who have content to share, but every single participant, every single person who's in the space has potentially a workshop or a talk or a presentation or something in themselves that they could potentially share with others. And I think that's, it's beautiful to acknowledge. And I just wish that more, and maybe it's something that we have to grow into as facilitators, to grow into this relaxation that whoever the people who show up are the right people. And if it's only one person, that's okay. I think there's a lot of, especially as you said, in the online space, so much anxiety and pressure around us to attract enough people to provide the right content, and forgetting that everyone is actually self-responsible. If it's not for them, they can leave, and it has nothing to do with us.
Seriously. Yeah, I think part of being that facilitator is just, you have to take your ego out, right? In every way, you have to put the participants' experience at the center. And as you said, that can look like the content. I always talk about, right, we should not see our learners as these empty cups that we need to fill, but really see every single person walks in with years of life experience, knowledge, values, interests, behaviors, stories that we can drink from. Everyone is a full cup and we can drink from. And I see that also, like you said, the ego, there's this initial idea, right, of, oh, we're there to host the space. We're there to, lead and guide the group. So that feels like, oh, we're on the spotlight. And it's not an easy thing to do. I'm not speaking that like, oh, this is so easy for me to like just kind of put myself as the guide on the side instead of, being more front and center. But I think the more I see myself doing that, right, the more, again, ownership is the word that always comes up, but the more ownership you can put on learners to really like create the space and co-create the space, it becomes, what comes out of those experiences are like 10 times more incredible and transformative than whatever I could have initially imagined by myself.
Yeah. And I love the concept of the full cup. Everyone enters as a full cup already. And I think there's a beauty also in knowing that we can just share our full cups. We can get rid of a little bit of our content and replace it maybe as a trade show. Okay, give you a little bit of mine. Can I have a little bit of yours? And I would be curious to hear from you how this then relates when you're stepping into the shoes of a trainer. And so the topic today is experiential learning. That's your big thing. That's what you do. And I wonder, to what extent can you apply actually these open space principles when you are coming into the space as the subject matter expert, where you are basically paid and hired to fill people's cups?
Great question. I think that there's a lot of misconceptions when we use this word trainer, right? I think in the worlds that you and I know each other in, Miriam, and there's kind of this idea that, okay, if you're a facilitator, then you're using experiences and you're really, creating these participant-centered approaches. But when you're a trainer, it's full-on lecture and subject matter expert. And if we look at the real theory behind experiential learning, we can see that, well, I don't believe this to be true, but also, when we look at the theory, it really shows us that as whether you call yourself a trainer or a presenter, we move through 4 different roles. One of them is a facilitator role. So basically that is, if we think about the experiential learning cycle, which I'll mention in a moment, there's all these different aspects from whether we are learner focused or subject focused, whether we're more on the meaning making or more action focused. And we want to adopt these 4 roles of facilitator, subject matter expert, standard setter, or what I think now is called evaluator, and coach, to really help move learners through all of those different areas and focuses. And so I really believe that all trainers must have facilitation skills, because that is still a key part. I proudly call myself a trainer because I really am trying to fully embody all 4 of those roles. I want to be a facilitator. I want to guide people through those experiences and processes. I need to be proactively asking the right questions to draw the meaning from those experiences. But I don't end there, right? Like, this is, what we think of typical facilitation. When I think of typical facilitation from the context of this experiential learning theory, it's really experience focused and then debriefs to draw out the meaning. I go further as a trainer because now I say, okay, there might be small nuggets where I am a subject matter expert. People are there to learn something particularly from me. So I will share nuggets of knowledge and information, but there's many different ways you can do this. You don't only have to do it through lectures, right? And then I'm also moving through the other roles of evaluation. How am I evaluating or setting standards for my learners so I can understand, what's the baseline of what they know or that they are doing before we have our training, and how can we measure that progress and growth over time so that we can actually say, hey, now we're helping you achieve your goals. And the last role is, again, the coach, because the coach role is about focusing on that, again, the learner focus, but with that action focus, which is often very much can be missing, is how do we take the learning forward? So it's not just, sometimes you can do this in an actual event and really taking a more personalized approach for individuals to help them and their progress. And sometimes this also happens even outside of a standalone training. And it's like, how do we keep the learning going over time? I personally don't do so much of these I do a lot of one-on-one consulting. I don't know. It's still hard for me to call myself a coach because this word, again, we have a lot of preconceived notions, but it's just really about supporting our learners in all these different facets with these 4 roles. That's, for me, what I see as a true trainer compared to facilitator.
So thank you. So if I understand it correctly, for you, in the best of all worlds, every trainer is an experiential learning facilitator.
Yeah, of course. It's one of the key aspects. I don't think, in order to be an experiential trainer, you have to be able to adopt that facilitator role because we need it. But again, then many people consider trainings that don't need facilitation skills because they think, okay, you're just standing at a room. There's movie theater style and you're just presenting information.
Yeah.
Then I maybe you call yourself a trainer, but I would not be able to call you an experiential trainer from my personal lens.
Yeah. I tried to wrap my head around the concept of experiential learning as training plus facilitation. And now I learned it's maybe rather lecturing or presenting plus facilitation plus coaching.
And evaluation. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And you mentioned the experiential learning cycle. And I would love you to walk us through that. And I would be very curious to your understanding or even definition of what would you consider an experience? Because I can imagine that there might be some who think, oh, experience, it's kind of extravagant. It's loud, it's colorful, it's music, it's performance, or maybe it can be very small. Maybe, does it have to be multisensory? All these questions are coming up. And I think of experience.
Yes. Okay. So there's so many different aspects here, right? So let's start with the core of experiential learning is what is an experience, like you just asked. So the way that, again, one, I just want to say that this is not something that I just made up. There's a real theory behind this. It was originally created, actually, it's now been over 50 years that David Kolb is the original creator and founder of experiential learning theory, based on, again, tons of learning scholars from many, 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 many years. And I need to just stress this because I use his definitions because I think there are constant misunderstandings about what experiential learning actually is. Is it just fun? Is it just fluff? It's interactive, it's engaging, therefore it's experiential. It sometimes hurts my soul how often I see this word just like thrown around without people really understanding, what is an experience and then what is experiential learning. So let's do that here right now. So David Kolb, he basically describes an experience as anything new that strikes the learner. This concept of striking a learner. It has to tap into, as you said, senses, emotions, novelty, presence. Being fully immersed in experience means we're fully present, right? And it's something, he uses this word struck, again, because I always love to also ask this word in debriefs of like, what struck you? Because everyone is going to share something totally different. Some people might talk more about it was the emotions that struck them, or it could be actually more the ideas that present that struck them because they were new, or it was different sensations. And an experience really is something that immerses you in that. It doesn't need to be, like you said, this big, we can create these huge, massive experiences and gatherings of tons of people and all the different, crazy, interesting holograms. I've seen all the kinds of, futuristic experiences. But if we even take it in the smallest sense, an experience could actually be a breakout room discussion, but it's an experience that strikes somebody because in some way it's new or it evokes new emotions. So an experience would not be a breakout room discussion where you're introducing yourself, because you can really do this on autopilot at this point. You're kind of like, yeah, I'm Romy. I'm a learning experience designer, experiential learning trainer. That's something I've probably said, millions of times by now. But if someone is asking me a thought-provoking question that I've never thought about, or someone, like we're talking about putting our learners in the center, somebody is sharing in a breakout room something that I've never thought about that, wow, maybe deeply resonates. Somebody's, mentioning a really vulnerable or really personal story that, gets to the core of my emotions. That could in itself be, in a very small scale, it's still an experience because people can draw meaning from any of these experiences. So I hope that gives a bit of context there.
Totally. And then we can create experiences by asking the right question.
Yeah. I think when I always kind of look at it in these two categories of more, I don't know if it's I haven't actually ever fully formulated the words here, so bear with me as I talk it out, but it's more like question probing, but more reflective, maybe more like restorative in a way of like meaning making. And yeah, an experience can be those questions and discussions, but we also want to, part of, learning and processes, we want to create lots of novelty. We want variety. And so we also want to create some more high energy. Maybe it's about the energies, right? These low energy and then the high energy of like, how do we make an experience that feels like it's much more than a discussion? We're actively involving, we're using our bodies, we're, getting really deep into immersive somatic practices, all of that then brings up a different kind of experience.
Yeah. And I wonder to what extent it's also about how and when you actually share the content with the group. And I wonder whether, because in the traditional lecture education style, you share content and then you test. Did you understand what I'm saying? Can you paraphrase? Can you synthesize? Or can you fill in the multiple choice? And in my understanding of experiential learning, and I'm a novice, so please correct me if I'm wrong, is that the learners experience something, and through that experience, they understand what the content is about,
yes,
more than being told what it's about.
Exactly. I mean, we'll get into this, but I think let's first look at, how David Kolb defines experiential learning. So he says, learning is the process whereby knowledge is created through the transformation of experience.
Okay, yeah, so the experience comes first.
Again, I've also had interesting talks with him. He says it doesn't necessarily have to go in that order. He does believe that as long as you have all the different elements I'll touch upon now, it can still be considered experiential. But he also says if we want to yield the highest impact, then we do go in that order. And personally, I always start with experience because I really believe that we have to let those experiences speak for themselves. Like human beings, we are just not, no one is ever sold on something if you just tell them this is the truth. This is why experiential learning works, is because it actually follows the patterns in our brain and how we think. When we experience something, that's when it really lands. I can read a book, I can, hear a lecture, I can watch a movie, all of this, but the only reason why a lot of that clicks with us is because we've had an experience that can either prove it to be true, or we can connect it back to like, wait a second, was that my experience? What happened? Because I had something else happen. This is how we are.
That's true for us. Because that's the only truth we know is what we feel, basically.
Exactly. And so the beauty of experiential learning is not just that it maximizes engagement or it puts the participants' full experiences in the forefront and in the center, but that it also follows, like I said, the neuroscience of learning and how we learn. And not enough people know that, right? Like I spent many years early on in my career designing and facilitating sessions without really understanding, like, how do we learn? And it was through looking for making learning more effective that I was like, oh, this is it. This is the underlying foundation. And so let's just quickly, I'd like to kind of walk into these four, what this experiential learning cycle is. As we already said, those four different educator roles, by adopting those roles, we go through the cycle. And there's, again, not lucky number 4, there's 4 different modes of the cycle. And so again, because experiential learning is about the transformation of experience, we can think of kind of these 2 poles that are really, there's a lot of tension between grasping new experience through these new experiences that you're creating, or even through knowledge. Maybe it's more just the grasping space. It could be through experiences or through the knowledge or information that is shared. But then we need to do something with it. We need to transform it. And so basically the 4 modes are this experiencing level. I always like to think of the visual of your heart, right? Because as we know now from experiences, we need to tap into our emotions, our senses. All of that is really that experiencing phase. So we already gave examples, but again, I always love to take an even meta approach. Like in life, You can have on a small level, a discussion. You can have a medium of an experience, a somatic embodied practice. But in life, you can say, okay, this whole training or this whole chapter of my life was one experience. Now, what have I learned from it, right? So this is the beauty of the cycles of spiral. What comes next from the experiences is reflecting. Like you said, we need to draw meaning from it. Otherwise, the learning doesn't fulfill itself, because this is a huge misconception that experiential learning is just learning by doing. If we were just doing learning by doing, we would just stay in that experiencing mode. But it's not. John Dewey, who was another very prominent scholar of experiential learning and contributed to David Kolb's work, he said that we don't learn by doing, we learn through the reflection of an experience, right? And that's where that meaning making happens. So in the reflecting zone, people need to see this, where as facilitators, we often debrief, right? What just happened for you? What kind of emotions came up? Or what did you notice and observe? Or what learning are you taking from that? And then we go into the thinking phase. This is the third mode. I keep calling it phases lately, and it's not phase because you can mix and match, but I use them as phases. They're modes, technically, modes of the cycle. And in the thinking mode, it's just really where, right, we're grasping new information. So here's where trainers can really tie in an experience learners had. Now they've drawn meaning from it. And now I'm maybe tapping more into that subject matter expert role of saying, here's new insights. So I don't know, if I was doing a training on facilitation, I might put people first into an experience where they have to just quickly facilitate, then reflect, maybe what did you learn or what did you take away from your own facilitation? And that would be now the thinking phase. I'm going to say, here's some of the top tips that I've learned through my experience of facilitation. But then it often ends there, right? And it's often okay, thank you very much. Now you got your top tips. Okay, we go. And we can't end there. We have to complete the cycle. And that's where the acting phase comes in. And this is where we're really starting to adopt more that coaching approach of what are you going to do? How can you take what you've learned here from the whole piece, not just from my lecture, but from all of those different modes of the cycle? And what are you going to use and apply moving forward? And oftentimes, we limit it to one intention, one takeaway, but we can really build out that mode even more in our sessions. So in that same example I just gave you, we might then say, okay, now you're going to facilitate again and put into practice what you've learned.
Yeah.
That really makes the learning come alive, because we need that deliberate practice. We need to, not just say, okay, I'm going to do something, but then actually do it. And then a new experience comes because they could draw new meaning from that, et cetera, et cetera.
And you give them a new pair of glasses, and then through the lens, they can see different things and make meaning of it. And then it sticks. And so one thing that crossed my mind was, the way you described experiential learning, especially focused on facilitation, is okay, this is the most natural way to train facilitation, because that's so ingrained in what we do. Do an exercise, be in there, debrief, try it yourself. Or get some nuggets and then try it yourself. And then the next thing that crossed my mind was, there's so many online learnings now of facilitation. So, question, is it possible to have an experiential learning experiential learning course that is asynchronous?
Great question. So I've actually been, because my specialization is really in experiential learning, I've actually been brought in and consulted with quite a few number of ed tech companies who exactly want that. They are curious on how can we make an app or a self-paced course experiential. And you can. I mean, the answer is you can. It's always going to be a different kind of experience than you would have if you have a group, of course. But it doesn't mean, unfortunately, again, if we look at the typical and average self-paced course, it's often, again, just watch these videos. It's one directional. We're just in that thinking phase where you need to grasp new information, but you're not transforming it in any way, shape, or form.
Because our cups are already full.
Exactly. You see? And this is why, some things that I've done that's been really successful is even with a self-paced course, how do you still find this sense of community and connection with other learners who are taking it from their own home? You don't necessarily need to have, a virtual or a live component. It can really help. There's a lot of research that actually shows that just having that sense of community is what holds people accountable. It's the number one reason people actually take these courses, even if they don't realize it themselves. But just, one thing that I've done with an ed tech company, which was really cool, was we were constantly asking questions, right? So, and people could submit their answers. And then even in the app, there would be like these word clouds coming to live of like, here's, 1,000 people who've taken this course, and here's the live word cloud of what's come out of this. Or having opportunities for the learners to record their own audio messages, having them record their own videos as well. So people can actually see the face behind like, oh, I'm not the only one in this course, and other people are here. And again, having them connected back to their own experience, I think is so important. It's about, looking at that full cycle. How can we create experiences, even if it's like fun, I don't know, mix and match things or test your own skills, or a way that, again, learners have to, the onus is on them to engage or to have a new experience that then they can reflect on or say, here's what I took away from this. Here's what I learned, even from a little, it could be as simple as a quiz. Okay, but now here's new content coming in. And the acting is so cool because you can give participants a challenge. It goes back to exactly what we were talking about at the beginning. How do we create more ownership on our learners so that they really feel like I'm co-creating this experience? I can't force anyone to do something, but I can say, okay, take whatever you learned here and now like make a challenge and now go do it and come back next week. And then you can reflect on how that was. Like, what did you actually do? What did you try out? Hold them accountable to share their learnings in whatever that course is, so that they actually go out in the real world and start putting their learning into practice.
Yeah. I think in the past, there was this big assumption that there are different types of learners. So some learn by reading, others learn by speaking, others learn by writing, and the others learn by listening, right? So the different senses. And if I remember correctly, there was also research saying, okay, that's total BS. We all learn through all these ways. How do you then, and I would assume then that you still have to cover all these different senses in the learning journey, so to really make it stick. How would you then do it in the online or offline context? Or what can we keep in mind when we design our experiential learning courses?
Totally. So there's two, I think, really great questions that I'm unpacking with your question. So the first one just is about learning styles. I gotta talk about this one. So yes, I think I still know educators that go to master programs to learn about learning, and people are still teaching about VARK, this, visual, auditory, reading, writing, kinesthetic kind of learner, and these learning styles saying, and learners use it a lot as an excuse. Like, I couldn't learn in the session because I'm a visual learner and this wasn't visual, right? And it's not only completely false, like you said, there's no research behind it, but it becomes a disempowering approach for everyone, because, there's this idea of like, okay, find out what kind of learning style, and then your educators or trainers or facilitators are going to, use that approach to really reach your learners. So I'll only use visual for you if you say you're visual. But you're right. Like, I've actually had lots of conversations with neuroscientists who said we all need all of them, right? Like, this is how we know a lot about brain science and how kinesthetic movement can really fire neurons and help us remember things. But if we just do one of those or a couple of those, we're not maximizing learning. I'll go into how I do that in online courses and different things in a moment. But I just want to say, again, going back to experiential learning theory, David Kolb actually coined the term learning styles 50 years ago. And unfortunately, it was taken so out of context, and people have used this. I mean, he's not connected to VARC, but he coined the term learning styles. And it's gone on now to where it is that he's now feeling 50 years later, he's like, I'm trying to change the language because we talk all the time about experiential learning styles. But now what we're trying to express to people is these are really learning preferences around the experiential learning cycle.
Mm.
So the same way I just explained to you the 4 modes of experiencing, reflecting, thinking, and acting, every single learner has preferences of where they feel most comfortable. So some people may love that experiencing part and they could stay there all the session. It just feels so good. Others might really love the reflecting and more like observation mode to draw the meaning from it. And others might be like, I really love the practical, the acting, putting things approach. Everyone has a preference. But the problem lies in when we cater to those preferences and we say, because you are comfortable and you could stay in this part of the cycle, we're going to only feed you this. The reality is, it's, as you know, it's our job as facilitators, as trainers, as anyone in the learning space to challenge our learners, to put our learners in the challenge zone. That's where really we can maximize learning. Because if we stay in our comfort zone, we're not actually maximizing our potential. So we have, I believe, a responsibility to go fully through the cycle with the 4 modes so that there's this interesting tension again of these parts I'm really comfortable and these parts, oof, this one, I am not feeling this, or ooh, I just can't wait for this part to be over. That's necessary because we need to develop everyone's learning flexibility. And that's the ultimate goal. And so when I talk about learning styles, I really mean that the Kolb's experiential learning styles, I won't go through them. There's 9 of them because they're basically, we're not in the magic 4 anymore, because basically it could be any one of the 4 modes, but then you also have other ones in between each mode. And then you also have a balancing mode. So some people may be like in that imagining space, which is that mix between an experiencing and reflecting, that they could just love to get in that imagining space and ideate ideas all day long and get creative and tap into those emotions and senses, but also start reflecting with meaning. And others could be on the opposite side of the end of like decision making, which is less about this, all the different ideas, but more like, I love to be near the thinking or the acting of like, what are we going to do? Let's make those decisions. So everyone has preferences, but we need to really develop our learning flexibility around it. Then I want to make sure I'm not talking like crazy, like a stereotypical trainer. So I want to hear some of your reflections first before I then answer your second question about kinesthetic and all that in the online space.
I like the term of that it's learning styles and learning preferences, because looking at our own preferences, it's not black and white. It's very nuanced, and that's what I hear in it. And I like the learning flexibility. It sounds like a muscle that you must train. And what I hear is getting out of the comfort zone. And what it reminds me of is that we learn through emotions, and we learn through the process of struggling and then achieving. And that's a muscle memory we're building, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when I think of, I'm back into running, and I take it seriously. And what I realized is that I could either go the easy route, it's just doing always the same, but then from time to time, I need to do the sprints in order to become faster. And from time to time, I need to slow down to an extreme that I'm almost bored in order to increase the possibility to run for longer. And I can imagine from what I hear from you is that it's very similar than with the learning styles, that if I want to expand my capacity to learn, I have to train this flexibility to bend into something that feels uncomfortable.
Absolutely. And that's why there is so much power in the self-awareness of understanding, like, what are my learning preferences? What is my, where do I gravitate towards? Because there's tremendous strengths. Like there's no style that's better or worse than others, right? Everyone brings something really unique and interesting. where I find things get quite interesting actually is when we think about when are we in situations that we're overusing our style, right? When you're overusing these strengths. Like, for example, I'm initiating learning style. So I'm in between the experiencing and the acting. And so one of my strengths is that I can be very flexible and adaptable in the moment. Like, things could, I think this is probably why open space principles really resonate with me, right? Like, anything could happen and I'm just like, okay, I'm going to adapt. We're going to flex. I'm cool with it. And I noticed that on the opposite side of the scale is the analyzing, right? Like creating these really structured, planned, really looking at all the possibilities and analyzing and then putting it into a very clear and concise structured order. And that mode, that learning style is definitely the farthest from the comfort for me, but it's the one I actually need to go forward towards, because when I overuse my initiating learning style and my strength, it can start to become a weakness, because it's like, there was a period where it's like, do I need to make a structure?
To wing it.
Yes, I'm so comfortable winging it.
Facilitator disease.
Yeah. And then I realized I need to find some structure. I need to really start taking more intentional time to make those structures so that I am envisioning all the possibilities, so that I can enhance my work even more. It's about that interesting balance, right, of having a structure, but then being able to wing it when I need to, right? Yeah. So I think that's why learning flexibility is something we all should be striving for.
Love that. And then finding opportunities or possibilities to mix and match the different ones. So I realize, for instance, yesterday I spoke to a friend and she mentioned that she purchased an ebook, and on the first page they said, okay, it's nice that you have the ebook. We really recommend to also buy the audiobook version and then to listen to it while reading. Like, oh, that's interesting, because it really forces you to focus, because our mind tends to just go places, either when we just read or just listen. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. Because we're speaking about the fact that we read all these pop science books and then don't remember what was actually in them. And I started to listen to the Blinkist after having finished the book, just as a reminder or refresher. I don't like just the short version because it lacks substance. But as a reminder, it's kind of a complementary learning style to listen to it after having read it.
I think this is, I see those those are like different modes of delivery. I see it as for me, they're very distinct from like experiential learning styles that are like, yeah. But I think, as you said, there's such potential in like, why are people limiting themselves to just do reading, writing? I mean, I think that idea is great, because how do we listen and read at the same time? The more that, for example, in online presentations, I can say something, what I say is clearly written on the screen, not like tons of different writing that people are trying to absorb information while listening. So then gets cognitive overload, but actually like, here's the quote, you're reading it, you're hearing it, and I'm going to ask you to do a body movement to like express how, what that comes alive for you. All of a sudden we're tapping into more potential for our learning, because people will remember those movements and connect it with the content.
Yeah. And what just comes to my mind is that more and more books now apply or try to introduce some experiences by having worksheets after a chapter, or asking to reflect, or asking to summarize, or to go out and do something and then jump on our readers only page and share a comment. And then suddenly it becomes an experience, and they're invited then to debrief on the experience.
Exactly. I think that's the beauty of it, right? Like, an experience could be, again, if we take a more high level approach, it could be, hey, I just read this article and it struck me. Like, something happened there, it struck me. But it's true, it will start to dissipate, and I'll lose it if I don't tell someone about it, if I don't spend a moment to reflect on it for myself, if I don't know, transform it in a different way, that it's like, hey, I just read this and now I'm going to do something about it. That's where the learning is really activated and comes alive. Again, going back to we need to transform our experiences to create that knowledge and learning.
Yeah. And where can it go wrong? So what's the biggest trap, or what brings an experiential learning workshop or program to fail?
I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is either if you don't have the four modes, right? Then it's not really an experiential workshop if you don't have those four modes. But I think maybe a couple of things. I think, one of the things that I really believe in is that how do we take a holistic approach to learning? So I specialize really, like, experiential learning is the foundation of everything that I do, but it's not the only thing that I do, right? And I have my own framework and model. I'm in the process of naming it and doing all the process to really finalize my patent on it. But I think for me, the real intrigue is how do we take all these different facets from our life and how do we spend time for psychological safety, like we just said, because people can't just start with like diving them into an experience. The example I gave before, I can't say, okay, hello, everybody. I'm Romy. We're here for facilitation. So you're going to start and facilitate. Go. People will not feel psychologically safe. And right then we're no longer in the challenge zone. We're in the panic zone. We're learning, our brain shuts down and we're in fight, flight, freeze, and nobody can actually learn in that process. So again, it's about how do we integrate experiential learning in the other things that we know we need, like psych safety, taking time for people to create the space, connection before content, all the things that we talked about in our last podcast episode. But then it goes further. Like I said, the principles of neuroscience and learning. I think it doesn't necessarily have to be that we spend equal time in all the four modes. But I think it can also go wrong when there's such little experience, such little reflecting, and so much thinking and so much lecture, right? And then we're again not tapping into the neuroscience of how people learn. We're not focusing on the generation of information from our group, from those full cups, right? We're not asking questions first and then giving our own insight. We're just telling, and trying to fill cups. Which we know that's not how people learn. The human brain is not a sponge like we think. We always use this analogy, like the human brain is like a sponge. We just absorb information. It's actually not true. It's like a sieve, like, when you make tea and, and the water kind of goes through, like, I think that's really what the human brain is like. We'll take and connect with different pieces of the content based on our own past life experience. And so we need to make sure that we are creating that balance. And of course, like behavior change, I think it's really easy to just say, oh, again, I'm trying to be even more intentional about this, even in a very short workshop online, because for a long time I was like, okay, it's really hard to go deep into the acting phase. All I can do is, ask people, put something in the chat you're going to do differently. But I think we need to tap more into what we know about how human beings change. We need to focus more on like, how am I spending time here at the end to really help create accountability systems for the learner and so that they have peer accountability? How am I tapping into what I know about how people change, of like, put something in your calendar right now. Don't just say it. And then we close Zoom and you never see it again, but like mark it in your calendar so that next week you'll see it there and you'll actually be triggered to do it. All of these different pieces have to come together to create a really holistic learning process. So sorry, to go back to your original question was, where does it go wrong? I think it's, not taking that wider lens and trying to just do these pieces and check off the box. Like, I'm doing experience, I'm doing fun, I'm doing thinking, I'm acting. It's again, taking a wider lens to see what kind of full, big picture experience are we creating for our learners?
Beautiful. And what remains your number one challenge when you facilitate / train?
I think it's always going to be time. I think lately I've been learning a lot about ADHD. And so I've had ADHD my whole life, and I never really thought very deeply about how it impacts my work and my life. It's always been like, my brain moves fast and I can sometimes be distracted, but that was kind of all I really knew. And I've lately been doing a lot of learning to understand ADHD, because I also want to not just understand for myself, but create more inclusive spaces and really helping and support neurodivergent learners and, in different realms. So for me personally, I learned recently, and I never knew this, that people with ADHD struggle with time management. They call it like time blindness. I was like, okay, because every single time somebody asks me, like, what is one of the key areas? I mean, I always say every single time I do a workshop, I'm always writing down, oops, I can do this better. I can improve this. It's not that I think I'm perfect in anything I do, but it's always usually the number one thing I always say is like, I always go back to that time management. Because of this time blindness, sometimes I think an experience will take a shorter amount of time than it actually does. The beauty is that, again, I can tap into my learning strength. So I know, like, in case my learning flexibility helps me create more structure, really go deep into the details of the analyzing style, be like, is that realistic time? Are you being a time optimist when you should be a time pessimist here, right? And so I'm working on that practice. But I think also then I can lean into my strengths of my learning style of initiating and say, okay, I noticed that I'm running out of time here. Let me tweak this a little bit in the moment without even the participants realizing I had a different plan, and it doesn't feel always so rushed. But I think that's always something I want to get better about, is like managing time and so I think creating more, the more that I can manage time, the more space I have for that acting phase at the end,
Yeah. And I love the concept of time blindness. And I read about an experiment that a group of scientists run, where they asked people who are generally always a little bit too late. So they're those people, they're always late. And there are those, they're always on time. And I'm German, and I don't think it's because I'm German that I'm always on time. It's just... And what they found is that the perception of time is indeed different. So they asked these random people to indicate when they believe that 10 minutes are up or 1 minute is up. Whereas those who are always on time, they were more accurate in their perception of the time that has elapsed. Whereas those who have a tendency to be late, they totally overestimated 10 minutes. So after 50 minutes, they were like, yeah, I think 10 minutes are up.
I actually facilitated this once. I did a workshop, and we had everybody stand up in separate parts of the room. We made sure that they couldn't be too influenced by the sounds. And we said, don't count in your head, but think, whenever you feel that it's been 1 minute, sit down. And it's like you said, some people sat down after 40 seconds and some people sat down after 3 minutes. It really was amazing experience for us to debrief on and talk about,
Yeah. And I think this creates a lot of empathy then also for the latecomers. They have a different perception of time, and it's something we cannot judge.
And vice versa, I feel bad because I know I was late today for this podcast, but in general, I am really, trying to be more on time. As a facilitator, I can never be late. That's for one. So that helps. But I think, many years ago, a friend once told me that, when you're late, you send a message to me that your time is more important than mine. And that was a new experience that struck me and my emotions, because I was like, I never want you to think that I think my time is more valuable. I was just, I left the house at the time that I should have been here because, the time blindness. I don't want to use that ever as an excuse, because I think it's really important to create empathy and understanding that, I want to create those safe spaces for everybody.
Absolutely. And then it's in the responsibility of those who have time blindness to create systems. I never start a workshop late. So I might wait for 2 minutes or 3 minutes because maybe our watches are not adjusted. And even that doesn't count anymore. I remember back in the days when I was young, I was like, oh yeah, but my watch is kind of slower than yours. And on my watch, it's the right time with the digital, and the cell phone doesn't work anymore. Because I think it's sending the signal to those who showed up on time, that they're not important enough.
Totally.
so that we start for them. And I would rather honor those who showed up on time than give them the impression. And also it sucks a lot of energy out of the space, I think.
Oh my gosh. This is why we do these unofficial starts, right? So important. I start early, a couple of minutes even before early, and let's engage participants from the moment they walk in the room. Let's celebrate them and honor them and thank them for being on time versus saying, thank you, we'll get started when everyone's here. And then people get their phone out and they're disengaged. And that's not how we want to start off and kick off the learning space. I'm right there with you, Miriam.
Yeah, although it really depends then also on the group. So if they're more from the corporate space, I think just giving them the opportunity to close all the time. Okay, you're here. That's great. You showed up on time, but I guess you rushed from the last meeting. So take a moment, write down everything that could distract you, close all the tabs, take a glass of water, stretch.
It's absolutely, it goes back to, right, the two categories of experiences. We could be in those lower energy, like space to really be more calm and restorative energy, right? Like have a mindful moment, prepare yourself. Or it could be higher energy, like put something in the chat. We're going to have music. We're going to start with the kickoff activity. We're going to do some drawing and annotating. Like it really depends what kind of experience you want to create. And I think that's why we mentioned empathy. Like empathy is such a core skill to have as an experienced designer, because we need to be, again, putting ourselves in the shoes of our learners and empathizing with their energy over time, with the emotions over time, with all of the different experiences that they're going to have in that full learning cycle, and really see how can I adjust and adapt my design to like really cater to what I think could be the most helpful and beneficial experience for them.
And although I'm aware that this could open a Pandora box of an entire new episode, I still would like to ask the question, since you mentioned the neurodiversity. So what are the key elements? Because I can imagine that when you look at neurodiversity, suddenly you don't have 9 learning preferences, but you have 1 million.
Yes.
So how can you possibly cater design in an inclusive way that would allow ADHD participants to engage and to connect to the content, or even maybe those who are rather in the spectrum of even autism?
I don't want to, I'm certainly not an expert in this, and I'm learning more myself. I can only share, what I've started to see and what has worked for me from my personal experience. Like 2 quick things that came up for me when you asked that was, one is, how are we creating more spaces for the co-creation, right? It's not me serving you, it's us creating this learning space together. So how do I get as many insights from my learners through as many touch points? How do I ask in surveys and questions in emails before they even enter the space, what do you need to what do you personally need to really maximize this session for you? Whether that's emotional, whether that's through learning, whether that's, I've had some people say, I need, I'm absolutely struggle with so much content. I get cognitive overload. So like, could we, I really, I do need more visuals instead of concepts. It's not about the learning style, but it was a very interesting approach. And it was like, okay, that was a great way for me to adapt. Or, even just asking people more what they need, I think throughout the process, helping people see this is a co-created experience, but it also needs that psychological safety. People need to know that they can come to us. Like I did a training a few months ago, and, we had a participant who was very open about his autism, and because we really laid such a foundation of psychological safety, he really felt comfortable to express even to the group, like, this is what I need from the group, or this is how I operate. And this might be different than what you're used to seeing, but this is who I am. And just creating that space that he felt he could be unapologetically himself. So he could ask for what he needed. He could leave the room whenever he needed. He could, express and emote a range of emotions based on, what was coming up. And I think that's why psychological safety is just so important, because it's easy to say, well, I asked the group, like, what do you need? What do you want? But a lot of times it's really hard to articulate, one, but second of all, like, if we don't feel safe, we can't let our guard down to really express that.
Expressing what we need and what we want is extremely vulnerable. Fear of rejection. And I think it's something that we don't necessarily learn as kids. Maybe the new generation does.
I hope.
Well, with all different setbacks or challenges that come along with that. But
Yeah. And I think, again, it goes back to the flexibility, like, create as many touch points, check in, read the room, see what's being spoken, but see what's being unspoken. And then, like, check assumptions, like, communicate. That goes back to the coaching role, right? It's like some in between. If I'm in person in a session, I might pull someone aside and be like, hey, trying to get to know somebody more and see, like, maybe there was, something I missed, or is there an assumption I'm making? How can I better create and craft those experiences for that group? Because I don't believe in off-the-shelf trainings. You can have your tried and true, but they always will need to be tailored to those specific audiences so that we can create more inclusive spaces for everybody and all kinds of learners.
Wonderful. Yeah, this sounds very empowering and encouraging. Thank you.
I hope so. Thank you.
Everyone can start doing that. Wonderful. One final question. If someone thinks, I'm doing some training, I'm maybe even an educator, what is the one small step that I can take to make the learning more experiential for my groups?
Ask questions. If it's like the smallest, littlest thing we can do is just ask more questions. It sounds so simple, but it is so underrated. Ask more questions for the group to learn about them. Ask more questions to the group to better see how what you're sharing relates to their personal life experience. Ask more questions before you share the content. See what the participants already know about the topic, and then share before, because otherwise, well, first of all, that also taps into, critical thinking more once they've thought about it. The human brain, we love questions, right? We really are these meaning-making machines. If you ask me a question, my brain is already going to start trying to find the answers. And so in the very most basic way, it's just, we can use questions throughout all the modes of the cycle to create experience, reflect, think, and act.
Beautiful. And what I hear is ask questions about the experiences and not questions to which you necessarily know the answer. So don't ask the questions that are kind of this, let me evaluate or let me test you, but let me be curious about you and let me help you to explore the content in your own experience.
Actually, that is what I found is one of the key detractors of experiential learning, is when you ask leading questions because you have a very clear, specific answer in mind and you're trying to get participants to get there. That's where all hell breaks loose. Yeah,
this makes me run away. I'm like, just spit it out. Give me the answer, but don't treat me like a stupid person.
And that's the beauty, again, of experiential learning, is that if we're asking these open-ended questions with genuine curiosity to learn from each full cup, each human being with valuable life experience in that room, then we are opening up possibilities for learning with and from our learners, not a one-directional relationship.
What else can we say after that?
Well, can I ask you a question? Because in the power of questions, to wrap up, right? And I think this is something I want to now even be more intentional about with podcasts, is like asking the learner, whoever is here listening to this podcast, but also asking you, Miriam, like, what are you taking away from this whole, we've talked about so many things, and I'm just curious from your own perspective, like, what resonated for you and what might you do differently in your own facilitation moving forward?
What resonated, or what I'm taking away, is that an experience can just be created by a question. So it doesn't have to be this humongous thing. And one action that I'm taking away is to be more intentional about the last step of experiential learning, of the putting it into action. So yes, it's nice to debrief, and then what? Go out and do it. Yeah.
Lovely. Thank you for sharing that with me.
Thank you for staying tuned and for listening until the very end. I hope that you found the inspiration and the wisdom that you are looking for. And I hope that you will subscribe to the show so that you never miss any of the interviews with another inspiring facilitator from across the world. I'm devoted to continue this podcast and to deliver weekly an episode that maintains the quality that you expect and you deserve. And if you would like to help me to maintain this quality and to keep the podcast free, please help us. Visit workshops.work/support to make a small donation to keep the podcast free. Thank you so much. I hope to be in your ears next week.